provision in the Medicare Modernization Act that requires the President to submit reform plans that seek to lower Medicare's take of the General Treasury, and Congress must give these plans expedited consideration. The trigger for this procedure will be tripped next year, paving the way for necessary action in 2008. To move forward successfully, we must begin to work together with the President right now to develop our desired changes in direction, to convince the public the need for this kind of reform, and to convince them that the reforms are right for them and right for the future. As conservatives, we have to summon the will not just to be critical of what is, but to do the hard work of proposing what can be. And nowhere is that more true than in the area of limiting federal spending. I'd be remiss today if I didn't say a word or two about earmarks. We've probably spent more time talking about what to do about earmarks over the past year or so than we have virtually any other aspect of the budget. I know that the sheer number of earmarks and a few well-publicized earmarks have come to symbolize our inability to control spending. Yet it's also true that someone either in Congress or in the depths of some agency is going to decide how every tax dollar is going to be spent. We frankly will achieve nothing in terms of saving money if we merely transfer the decision-making power from one end of Pennsylvania Avenue to the other. Voters have routinely proven that they don't consider the amount of bacon a member brings home to their district to be the sole measure of success for an incumbent. We should remember that and seek to define success in our ability to reform these programs rather than to earmark these programs. Just as financial responsibility and limited government have been at the core of the conservative movement, so is a defense of traditional values. I want to focus on that word defense for a moment because that's really what we've been doing for way too long in the pro-family movement. We've watched for decades as liberal activists use the federal courts to undermine our values and to limit the ability of local communities to set their own standards or even place a copy of the Ten Commandments on the courthouse wall. We've watched as liberal activists use taxpayer money and government coercion to push their views on our families. In every one of these instances, conservatives were defending against these onslaughts. We were fighting for the right of families and communities to set their own standards and not someone else's standards imposed on them by some distant court or some distant bureaucracy. We've allowed the so-called mainstream media to characterize our efforts to encourage families and traditional values as cynical votes for the base or as votes due the family groups. In a hard September fight, just weeks ago, in a hard September fight to eliminate internet gambling, there was too much reporting and possibly too many comments on Capitol Hill about what good politics this was instead of what good policy it was. The point should never be how many votes the family groups were promised, but should always be another step in advancing issues that protect core American values. Every one of these political debates in the future we need to always see are based on principle and never let the media convince us or never be part of helping the media convince anybody else that we're just having these votes for the show of having the vote. There needs to be a principle involved. We need to defend that principle. We need to be committed to those values. We need to also recognize that the erosion of traditional values is often done incrementally, and in fact we can counter it incrementally and through process on occasion. One bill I think was important that didn't receive very much attention this year, but which I think has the power to create a more level playing field for local communities, is Congressman Hostetler's proposal to deny the ACLU and groups like the ACLU the ability to collect damages and attorney fees in Establishment Clause cases. Right now, the fear of losing a multi-million-dollar lawsuit to the ACLU means that a local school board or a local city council makes a financially driven decision. And if you've ever talked to anybody on a school board who had one of these cases, they always had that set down with their lawyer, said, well, we think we may win, we may lose. If we lose, here's what it's going to cost the school district. And then the decision is not whether we're right or wrong, but can we afford to take the chance. This legislation, the Hostetler legislation, passed by the House, still passed by the House and over in the Senate right now, would return the debate to the merits of Christmas carols or a manger scene or a menorah rather than whether the local government can afford to lose the case. We should not allow the intimidation of local governments by these groups based on financial considerations. In another bill, Senator Lamar Alexander, and I introduced a bill that would restrain the ability of federal courts to run state and local institutions indefinitely. Reversing these so-called consent decrees requires elected officials to do their job. As conservatives, we need to set about identifying other similar opportunities and reversing bad policy and bad process so that we can reinforce traditional values. And we must seize these opportunities, not because they appear on a list that somehow we promised people we'd vote on, but because they're the right thing to do. We can't continue to let the media or ourselves in any way suggest that a values agenda is an agenda about politics. A values agenda is an agenda about the right kind of society. Tuesday's results give us a great opportunity to once again to define and fight for big ideas. One of the geniuses of our political system is that no one party has a permanent claim on power, a fact that voters can and do emphasize when they think it's necessary. This means any viable political movement, a movement like ours, conservatives in America, can never afford to become stagnant or complacent. We must constantly refresh our ideas, we must constantly assess how we're doing, and we need to constantly make corrections when it's necessary. This is a great moment to do all three of those things. For a generation, Reagan conservatives have consistently demonstrated the ability to do just that. Nowhere has there been more evidence of our ability to respond than our response to the threats of Islamic totalitarianism and our fight with our terrorist enemies. During the Cold War, it was conservatives, just like it has been, I think, in many ways during our recent challenge. During the Cold War, it was conservatives who refused to buy into the argument that the best the United States could hope for was coexistence with the Soviet Union. When asked about his plan for the Cold War, Ronald Reagan said, "We win, they lose." Not very complicated, but it worked. And why did it work? It worked because conservatives believed that a clear and strong public resolve, alliances that made sense for us and created problems for our enemies, a commitment to develop the technology and expend the resources necessary to outlast our enemy would ultimately secure our victory. And it did. While the threats of Islamic totalitarianism at times require different tactics, we're approaching those challenges with the same resolve that allowed us to defeat communism. I'm convinced that in this fight we will prevail because the American people will understand the need to prevail. We must continue to lead the fight against totalitarianism and sustain the will to win the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. On the domestic front, we have to develop a plan to govern that's based on our core principles, our core values of limited government and defense of American values. Our plan must avoid the mistakes of the past several years. There must be a counterculture to the culture of spending. We must develop and promote reform of entitlement programs, and we must respond directly, forthrightly, and confidently to the attacks on traditional values. I take each of these challenges very seriously, and talking to many of my colleagues in the days before the election and the days after, I know that they do too. For these challenges represent an opportunity to more clearly define who we are, not just as a movement of conservatives, but who we are as a country. I'm confident we will successfully move forward. And why am I so confident? I'm so confident because of the strength of the conservative movement that lies in our faith in the American people and the fundamental unchanging principles of the Declaration of Independence, of the Constitution, that have defined our government. We have had real setbacks before, and each time we pointed our way to a greater success. 2007, 2008 are opportunities to once again revisit who we are. Let the American people know what we stand for. We say we want to cut spending, and we will. We say we want to reform the welfare state by empowering citizens to make their own decisions, and we will. We say we want to defend traditional American values, and we will. We say we want to